Much of Western moral philosophy in the last centuries was a battle between the big two, deontology and utilitarianism, with Immanuel Kant being the big daddy of deontology and Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill the bosses of utilitarianism. Deontology is about finding out what our rights and duties are, while utilitarianism is concerned with maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. But there used to be another big contender in normative ethics, virtue ethics. Most famously associated with the works of Aristotle, it was only roughly in the 1950s when philosophers again focused a lot of attention on it. The new debate on virtue ethics recently culminated in scientists coming after this ethical theory and trying to disprove it empirically, which is quite unusual for a normative theory, so let's dive in. The rediscovery of virtue ethics is attributed to an influential article by the American philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe. The article was published in 1958, and in it, Anscombe offered a sweeping critique of the big two, with no punches being pulled. Kant and all of deontology were criticized as being nothing but a residue of Judeo-Christian philosophy. Concepts that are used in deontology, such as duty and ought, only make sense when we assume that there is a universal moral law that was commanded by someone, most likely by God. If God's moral law demands certain actions, then there might be duties and things that we ought to do. But once we get rid of God in our justifications of duties, what else is there to uphold the demands of duties? Nothing, Anscombe thinks. So that's a big problem for deontology. But what's wrong with consequentialism and utilitarianism? Something quite similar in her view. After all, if we lose God, then how do we decide which consequences to maximize? Utilitarianism is concerned with bringing about happiness and reducing suffering. But who is to say which kind of happiness matters? The happiness a psychopath gets from murdering people? Or the happiness a homophobic society gets from what we would describe as discrimination? If utilitarians simply rely on the society's current standards, these can turn out to be quite rotten. So without God, there's no clear criterion that utilitarians can use. Given that these theories are in a bad shape, Anscombe recommended turning back to virtue ethics. After all, Aristotle was quite fine without duties or utilitarianism. According to virtue ethics, the focus is less on action and more on the character of a person. Being a good person and living a good life is what we should focus on in ethics. Morally good actions are those which a virtuous person makes. In Aristotle's view, the virtuous person would always be somewhere in between two extremes. For example, the virtue of courage is somewhere between cowardice and recklessness. So the virtuous person is always something in between two unappealing extremes. So that's the basic idea of virtue ethics. Why would psychologists think that there is something wrong with such an ethical theory? Virtue ethics bloomed since its discussion in the mid-50s of the last century. And with more discussion comes more criticism. One that I want to look at here comes from an unlikely source for ethical theories: social psychologists. More precisely, psychologists wanted to go after one of the central empirical assumptions of virtue ethics, that there are stable character traits in the first place. After all, if a person's action is determined by the circumstances of the situation, not their character, then virtue ethics would seem to have a problem. An ethical theory that builds on something which doesn't exist probably won't work well, especially if it wants to tell people how to live a good life. So how did psychologists go after our character? They looked at studies that intended to show that people's actions are very dependent on the circumstances they find themselves in. Two of the more extreme but well-known examples are the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment. In the Milgram experiment, Stanley Milgram was driven by the question how ordinary people could be drawn to obey even when faced with cruel orders, as was for example the case during the Nazi reign in Germany. So he wanted to test whether authority and circumstance can drive normal people to very bad behavior. In the study, participants were made to believe that they would induce electric shocks on other participants if these failed a memory and learning task. With every failure, the intensity of the shock went up. When participants hesitated, the experimenter insisted on continuing with the experiment, emphasizing that it was important for science. A worrisome amount of people continued with the electric shocks, even when the voltage suggested that it was deadly, and the other participants screamed that they wanted to stop the experiment and then even stopped reacting to the shocks entirely. In the Stanford prison experiment, people similarly acted in surprisingly cruel ways. Philip Zimbardo, who ran the experiment, divided participants into prison guards and prisoners. These were supposed to simulate the environment of a real prison. After a few days, the prison guards appeared to start to harass and even molest the prisoners, and the experimenters had to intervene and ultimately end the experiment. Situationists point to such studies in order to suggest that ordinary people can be drawn to cruel behavior depending on the circumstances of the situation. But of course, there weren't only such extreme cases. Participants in other studies who found a dime in a phone booth were much more likely to help a stranger after exiting that phone booth than those who didn't find a dime. Which is surprising, as you wouldn't expect a person's empathy to depend on finding a dime in a phone booth. So these circumstances appear to determine how we would act. Not much room left for virtue ethics to do their job. If character traits don't translate into action, then virtue ethics has a problem. What's the point of developing character traits if they won't be of much help in order to become a good person or live a good life? Virtue ethics had to respond, and this is what they did. First, virtue ethicists can directly attack the empirical basis of the critique. As we have talked about on this channel before, the replication crisis hit empirical sciences really hard, especially social psychology. Roughly speaking, a replication is the attempt to redo a study another time under as close as the original circumstances, in order to test that the supposed effect is reliable. As it turns out, a lot of the studies that the situationists relied on didn't replicate all that well. Surprisingly, finding a dime in a booth doesn't make you a good person after all. The famous studies also came under fire. The Milgram experiment was criticized because after the original material was digitalized and made more easily available, people found several problems with it. Not only did Milgram deviate from the script and straight out lied in some cases, but more participants than he disclosed actually thought that the study was a hoax and simply went with it because of that. The same is true for Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. Recently, scholars have argued that many participants, especially the prison guards, were actually pressured by the experimenters themselves into being more aggressive, and some of the data was cherry-picked by Zimbardo. What about the current state of the data? Well, it's complicated. Situational factors can have effects on moral judgment, but it's hard to say whether the extent to which it does is a problem for virtue ethics. So we don't need to throw virtue ethics in the bin just now. Second, defenders of virtue ethics can claim that virtues are simply really rare and that it is extremely hard to be a genuinely good person. If so, it would not be surprising that random people who typically take part in such studies do not show evidence of excellence in character. Rather, this is exactly what we would expect in such a case. Is that a good response? Well, if only ever very few people are really virtuous, and maybe can ever be really virtuous, then that seems to be unhelpful. After all, virtue ethics is about telling people how to live a good life and be a good person. If barely anyone can make it, why even bother with it? I'd be pretty bummed out. So maybe this is not the best response for virtue ethicists. Lastly, virtue ethicists can go for an ameliorative response. This is also what some of the situationists go for, though maybe a bit too strongly. The idea of the ameliorative response is to say that knowledge about situational influences should be made part of the virtue theory. A virtuous person is not only one who often enough acts virtuously, but who also has the intellectual virtue of noting when they would not be able to do so. In such a case, they can simply evade the situation in which they know they wouldn't be able to be virtuous. If a good person knows that they will drink too much if they go to a bar, they will not go to the bar in the first place or find ways to account for that situational weakness. So this is the story of how scientists came after virtue ethics. What do you think? Is virtue ethics in any trouble? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It really helps a lot.